And it's a collection of 5 stories, short stories, except they're all quite long short stories. How do I advance?
Is it working? Left clicker? You just click on the screen?
Right.
Oops. I think if you just left click on this.
Left.
Yeah, or you can click the next on the menu that pops up. Oh, yeah. And also.
Huh. It worked when I tried it out before.
If you really need to, you can right click it and the menu pops up and just click the top button right there.
That's going to be awkward during my reading.
Maybe does the left. And if you just click the left on top of this one, finish doesn't matter.
On top of the image?
Try that. And I'll get my
Okay, I'll try it next time. So the book is kind of built around this story called Watergate Sue. I was invited by the New York Times to do this story in 2007. They'd been running serialized. Hi, Dan. They'd been running serialized comics in the weekly magazine for about 3 years, and each cartoonist got like a 6-month run, so it would be 1 page every week, ending in a 24-page story. And I think they got in touch with Fantagraphics and asked for a recommendation, and they said they wanted a woman because I don't think they'd had any women cartoonists thus far. And I was one of the people they recommended. I fairly recently had a baby. My baby was 8 months old when the New York Times contacted me, and you don't really say no to an opportunity like that. So, but I had to kind of get up and running with the story really fast, and they wanted me to have 3 episodes done before it started running because they have, just this brutal deadline. So for years I had this idea of doing a graphic novel about Watergate. My mother had been obsessed with following the Watergate hearings when I was a kid. And I was young enough, I didn't really know what was going on, but I definitely noticed her intense focus and yelling at the TV and stuff. And so I thought it would be interesting to do a sort of family story, but also look into what actually happened during Watergate, because I never really had all the fine points of that. So when the New York Times came along, I'd already been thinking about it, had some notes, had some ideas. I thought, okay, I'll go with something that I've already kind of made some plans for. And then since I just had a baby, I thought, well, I'll do baby stuff, and somehow it'll work together. So it's mostly about a character loosely based on my mother, Eve. Here's Eve, and they're watching the famous speech where Nixon says, "I am not a crook." And my mother literally kicked the TV over, and for the rest of the time we had that TV, the knob broke off when it fell, and we had to turn the TV on with pliers. So I immortalized that moment. So the second story in the book is, here's a panel from it, it's called Cats in Service. And I didn't start this story until maybe 5 years after I finished the Watergate story. I had kind of a fallow period. We moved back to Seattle. I was raising a kid, and I was having a lot of ideas and writing them down in notebooks and sketchbooks, but wasn't really drawing comics much. And then she started kindergarten, and I had more time. And this was the first story I got going on. And it's partly based on a dream. I was watching Downton Abbey at the time, and I had this vivid dream where I had the whole retinue of servants that they had in Downton Abbey only they all lived with me in my tiny little house in Seattle. So in some ways it was nice because they did all the work, but in other ways it was really awkward because we're always kind of like, climbing over each other. And I was drawing cats for my daughter all the time. All she wanted was for me to draw cats back then. So I just started drawing the servants as cats, and I just kind of fell in love with them. And for a while, the story was just wish fulfillment. It just brought me a lot of pleasure to draw these cats folding the laundry and mowing the lawn and arranging flowers. And I didn't really know where it was going. But I had this yearning to start making comics in a new way, like to not write a script ahead of time and then adapt it to a comic strip, but to like draw first and let the story kind of evolve through the drawings. So I had fun with these cat housework drawings for a while, but then I started asking myself questions like, well, where did these cats come from? And why do they have little maid outfits? And what happens when you essentially have cat slaves? So those questions were what turned it into a story for me. And it doesn't end well. I won't get into the specifics, but it doesn't end well. So the third story in the book is called The Egg Room, and it's also somewhat based on a dream. I had a dream during this fallow period I'm talking about where I wasn't really making comics, that I was in a fancy department store that had a food hall, and there was an annex to the food hall that was just eggs, and there were edible eggs, but also decorative eggs, and they were all beautifully packaged and arranged. And the dream was in full color. It was just this lush image that stuck in my head. And I knew that I wanted to somehow make a comic out of it, but there was no story attached. And I don't remember anything about the dream except being in the egg room. So again, I just began with drawing what I could remember of the dream, and at first not worrying too much about the story. So these are some of my earliest drawings of that story, and as it unfolded, I started writing to kind of figure out what it was about and who the main character was. And it turned out that the main character was this woman named Florence, who she was an artist, and she had a lot of ambivalence about whether she was going to have kids or not. And so the egg thing it was part of her dream life, but it was also sort of this metaphor. And I wound up doing the story in watercolor, as you can see, because I wanted to capture that really vivid color of my dream and also just the sort of fluid blurriness between dreams and real life sometimes. So here's one of the pages from that. And I wound up taking a watercolor class actually, because once I started it, I realized I'd always just kind of faked my way with watercolors. I didn't really know what I was doing, and I needed a little technique to make the comic look the way I wanted it to. There we go. So the next story in the book is it's called Corin Voss, and it's set in the late 40s after World War II. And it's the first time I've done a story that took place in a time period that I hadn't lived through. So I started with family pictures, but it became more kind of, the history of that period became more relevant to the story as it grew. And so I wound up doing quite a lot of research. And I found this awesome collection of color photos in the Library of Congress collection, color photos from the 1940s, which, as you know, are pretty rare. Like most amateur photographers didn't have access to color back then, but professionals did. And there's something about seeing the 40s in color that brought it so close, like made it seem much more relatable than all the black and white photos I'd seen before. So I really made use of those Library of Congress pictures. And I shared this one with you in particular because I just love how all those girls are wearing these matching dresses. And I mean, no shade to the mom who sewed those dresses, but they look very like handmade, and like she made them in about, maybe half an hour each tops. So here's a page from Corin Voss. So it's not literally my grandmother. I kind of borrowed her situation, which is that she was a divorcee in the late 40s. She had 2 daughters who she had to raise by herself, and she had to work to support them. And she always had money troubles, and she always had love troubles. And that was the vibe that I was going for. But the events of the story are not literally things that happened to my grandmother. For example, in the story, Corin is working at a copper refinery, and she loses her job because all the guys from World War II are coming home from the war, and their jobs are given back to them, and so she's out. So that's sort of how the story begins, and she's kind of like scrabbling for money and work for the rest of the story. And the last story in the book is called The Golden Lasso, and it's really the first story I've ever done that's pretty much 100% autobiographical. It's about me, although I call myself Diana in the story. When I was around 13 years old, I was obsessed with rock climbing, and I was determined to be the greatest woman rock climber of all time. And it was kind of that first experience of having a kind of ambition, a sort of worldly ambition that kind of drives you. I think a lot of people maybe first experience that in their early teens. And I wanted to capture that. And I'm sort of incapable of not including elements of magical realism in my story. So the character that's based on me has a magic golden lasso like Wonder Woman. That I made up. I did not have one as a child. But anyway, so that's the golden lasso. And now, that's like one of the last panels in that story. Me coming back to my middle-aged self. But now I'm going to do a reading with a little bit of sound from the Watergate Sioux story. So I gotta make sure that my Bluetooth speaker's working. And then it'll come. Sounds promising. Okay. Got my mouse.
But you ought to thank me before I die for the gravel in your guts and the spit in your eye.
Will Mommy be okay? She's fine. She just has to stay in the hospital till the baby comes.
I'm the son of a bitch that named you Sue.
Who's that singing? That, my dear, is Mr. Johnny Cash.
There will be no resignation, even if the full House votes to impeach. Besides, the President is confident that the House will not impeach.
Hang in there, baby Elliot. This isn't how Mommy makes the eggs. Hurry up, Joes. You're going over to Teddy's house. But I don't want to go to Teddy's. Tough.
Good evening. This is the 37th time I have spoken to you from this office, where so many decisions have been made that shape.
C-section. They just put her under. Should be a few hours.
And other leaders, I have concluded that because of the Watergate matter, I might not have the support of the Congress that I would consider necessary to back the very difficult decisions and carry out the duties of this office in the way the interests of the nation will require.
So where can I take you, Mr. President? San Clemente? Might as well.
I have never been a quitter.
Yeah, just a crook. Hey, show a little respect.
To continue to fight through the months ahead for my personal vindication would almost totally absorb the time and attention of both the President and the Congress in a period when our entire focus should be on the great issue of peace abroad.
I've got this traveling coffee pot Julie gave me. Want some? Don't mind if I do.
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
About time, creep. Man, good thing Eve's missing this. She would have destroyed the TV by now.
I regret deeply any injuries may have been done in the course of the events that led to this decision.
Hope I haven't let you down, Eve.
To serve in government, if that is your wish. Always give your best. Never get discouraged. Never be petty. Always remember, others may hate you. But those who hate you don't win unless you hate them. And then you destroy yourself.
I'll miss hating him.
And so we leave with high hopes.
Josie, this is historic. Nixon's actually leaving office.
And you will be in our prayers. Thank you very much.
I'm tired of Nixon. I'm tired of being quiet. I just want things to go back to normal. Ah, Joes, there's no such thing as normal. Okay, what do you say we go meet your baby sister? What? So that's all I got for you, but happy to answer any questions if anybody has any. And thanks for listening.
So when you were putting the collection together, it seems like a lot of the stories are about motherhood. Was that kind of a conscious decision, or did they just fit, or was that like you realized that kind of like motherhood was going to be this theme throughout?
Well, I wanted to do some stories that would go well with Watergate Soup. That's always kind of how I pictured the book. I was surprised that they all wound up so long, because it turns out that Watergate Soup is the shortest story in the book. And I always kind of thought of it as the centerpiece. But yeah, so that was on my mind, that the theme of motherhood and caretaking would, probably continue through the book. But it was also so where I was at the time that it, I had, like I sort of alluded, I went through this period where I really wasn't working on comics much, and then when I was, it was finishing up my graphic novel Artichoke Tales, but by then all the drawing was done and I was just like doing production work on the computer, and it was very kind of mindless and not particularly creative. but I was having a pretty vivid dream life, as I mentioned, and also I would just occasionally get ideas, and so I was jotting a lot down at that time. And so when I started work on the cat story first, like I already had like a few vague ideas in mind. And I wound up actually working on, I sort of started them all at once and had like a lot of pots boiling. And then over the next 8 years or so, depending on what was going on, would work on one or another. And so they each kind of, it sort of went like this. So they were always kind of all talking to each other, I think. Yeah.
Can you talk about the title of the book and if that's from one of the stories or yeah?
It's not really from one of the stories. It's you know how like we're all so bombarded with media, like you can't remember if it was like a podcast or a TV show or a radio interview where you heard something, but I heard something. It was a woman being interviewed and she was talking to another woman, and it was sort of about this sort of job that so often falls to mothers, although it falls to all kinds of caretakers, and where you kind of do all the in-between stuff, and it's not like all written down in a list, but you just know it needs to be done to kind of create family life. And she was like, you know, like who will make the pancakes and stuff like that. And it just really stuck in my head. Who will make the pancakes? That's a very good question. And so it just kind of became, just in my life before it became a book title, it became like my, like just this sort of metaphor in my head for like, who's the person who's holding, you know, a family unit together. Yeah.
You've spoken previously about the longer short story being the type of narrative you prefer to tell, and how you're not anticipating doing another long graphic novel like Artichoke Tales. Is it because that's the kind of storytelling that you gravitate towards? Is it because it's more achievable as a cartoonist? Is it something else?
Well, the book of short stories that I did before this one, that came out before Artichoke Tales, it was stories that I was working on concurrently with Artichoke Tales. There were a lot of comics anthologies going on in the early and mid-aughts, and well, Jerome, for example, edited a few of them. And so you would, as a cartoonist, and we all have this experience, you would get invitations to do a short story for an anthology. So while I was working on Artichoke Tales, I was just kind of like this little stack of short stories was building up. And so I put out that book, which is called Squirrel Mother. And those were most of them were quite short, you know, just 2 or 3 pages. But I wanted to do some original work for that book. So the longest story in the book, I think, is maybe 20 pages. And that did kind of feel like, oh, that's more where I want to go. And Artichoke Tales, just, I like it. It's my baby, but it was really arduous sticking with like exactly the same drawing style, exactly the same production look for many years, because everything takes me many years. You know, I have other work I have to do, and I'm also just slow. And I had so much more fun doing the short stories. And I've had the same experience with Girl Hero, to be honest. Like, I've been doing this like ongoing story in Girl Hero, but I actually had more fun doing the short stories. So I think after Artichoke Tales was done, I just had to kind of face facts that I'm not really a graphic novel person. I'm too restless, and I have a lot of ideas, and so doing short stories just kind of fits with my artistic constitution better, I think.
Since you brought up Girl Hero, do you want to talk a little bit about that and then how that led to the other things that you were working on? How you shifted from that?
Yeah, sure. Well, Girl Hero, I started with 8-ball in mind as a model because Dan Clowes was doing 8-ball where half the book would be part of an ongoing work that would eventually be collected, and then the other half was these little backup short stories, and I liked that model. And but quickly, my sort of post-apocalyptic feminist saga, I kind of painted myself into a corner narratively, and I wasn't an experienced enough cartoonist to realize, like, I'm in charge. Like, I kind of let the story, like, I felt obligated to the story in this weird way. It's kind of hard to explain. But I just found myself doing long scenes that I thought were incredibly boring because I couldn't figure out narratively how to get around them. And so again, I had so much more fun with the short stories I was doing in Girl Hero. And by the time I finished the main story in Girl Hero, I was like, I never want to see you again. And I've never reprinted it. But I learned a lot, and I feel better about it now. Like now when I look at those issues, I feel sort of a fondness for that young cartoonist who was figuring it out. At the time, right after I finished, I was kind of like, but I think that's pretty typical of artists looking at their old work. But anyway, I met a guy, Tom Devlin, who was starting this publishing company called Highwater Books, and he offered to do a book collection of the stories from Girl Hero. And again, I did 2 original stories to round out that book. But yeah, I mean, every step of the way, the signs always pointed towards you're more of a short story person. Of course, the Corn Boss story in Pancakes is like 60 pages long, so you could argue about that's really a short story. I don't know. But yeah.
This is my first exposure to your work, but from what I saw tonight, it seems like maybe a wide range of ages would appreciate what you do, and I'm curious if you have kids and adults reading your work, and who your kind of intended readers are, or who you want to be reading.
Mm-hmm. Well, I draw in, as you can see, this sort of round, cute style. So I think often when bookstore people and shoppers see my art, they think, oh, that must be kid friendly. But I've always really liked to deal with, especially with issues of sexuality. And so it kind of depends on the kid, you know? I mean, I think some of my stuff is completely appropriate for a YA audience, but it just kind of depends. And when I'm making my stories, I'm not feeling like concerned about whether it's okay for kids. I write for adults, but I know a lot of people who have shared their copies of my books with kids, but it's kind of like case by case, I guess.
I think our library has Artichoke Tales and YA.
Yeah, I think Artichoke Tales is probably the most reliable YA-ish.
And the characters in it are kind of younger teenagers.
Yeah. Well, thanks you guys. Really appreciate you coming out. If I'm gonna sit here and sign books if anybody wants me to, and yeah.
Go ahead.